Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 19th of July, 2023, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, myself, Brian Gerrish. We're delighted to have Vanessa Beeley from Damascus. We also have Debbie Evans, our very own nursing correspondent, and we have a guest. Let's try again. Vanessa, over to you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, loud and clear.
Oh, good. So basically, we started talking about the situation in northern Syria, which has been heating up for the last 2 weeks with the buildup of Russian and Syrian Arab army troops. And in the last 48 hours, there's been claims by the Americans that a Russian fighter jet flew dangerously close to a US warplane over Syria. And just moving on to the next section, Brian. So a Russian fighter jet, according to American reports, flew very close to a US surveillance aircraft over Syria and gassing in the northeast, forcing it to go through the turbulent wake and putting the lives of the 4 American crew members in danger. So while the US is illegally occupying and has illegal military bases and air bases in Syria, it's blaming Russia for putting its military personnel at risk. And then just moving on, there were previous cases. I always find this language quite amusing, that a Russian fighter jets are harassing US drones over Syria twice in 24 hours. A Russian Su-35 forced 2 French Rafales to take evasive maneuvers over the Iraq-Syria border on Thursday, as the Pentagon warned of increasing harassment by Russia. I would also note here that Russia has also been bombing the terrorist positions around the Al-Tanif US military base, unlawful military base in the southeast. There are claims by Washington also that Russia and Iran are quietly coordinating in Syria to pressure the US to leave Syria, which again is under international law perfectly acceptable, that the US stops occupying Syrian territory and resources. And then moving on, we have a statement, which is an extraordinary statement from the US Defense Department about the use of cluster bombs by Russia in Syria. Let's roll that.
There's been reporting that the Russians are using cluster munitions in Syria, which we also find to be irresponsible. These munitions will they have a high dud rate. They can cause damage to. They can hurt civilians, and they're just not good.
The same cluster bombs, of course, that the US is currently supplying to Ukraine, but Russia uses them, they're bad. America uses them, they're good. And then let's have a look at the news section on the buildup of American troops in northeast Syria.
2,500 10th Mod Division soldiers off to combat. Members of the 2nd Brigade combat team heading to Iraq and Syria. Today, the division held a ceremony officially marking the deployment. 7 News reporter Chad Charette was there.
Friday morning, soldiers geared up for deployment overseas. Commanding officers wished them well.
This combat deployment is significant. It's significant for the soldiers and the families of this brigade, for the 10th Mountain Division, and for the United States Army, because once again, we are called to lead the way and to start another climb to glory.
2,500 members of the 2nd Brigade combat team will be spending the next 9 months in Iraq and Syria as part of Operation Inherent Resolve, an ongoing military operation to defeat the Islamic State.
They're well trained, they've been there before, and we have recency in this division, and so they're going to succeed.
But before their departure, a ceremony symbolically sending off soldiers. Attendees bowed their heads for an invocation. Then, soldiers led by Colonel Scott Wentz cased, furled, and placed the brigade's flag in a canvas covering to keep it safe for their trip overseas.
Once the units are in theater, they will uncase their colors as they assume the fight.
And for the folks back home, Colonel Brayman credits the North Country community for supporting brigade members' loved ones. Peace of mind for the soldiers overseas.
We are fully integrated here in the North Country, and they have nothing to worry about while they're gone, which makes them be able to focus on their mission, get home here shortly.
A brigade ready for battle, deploying for 9 months, with loved ones waiting for them to come back home to the North Country. Chad Charette, 7 News.
course, what is this doing? This is maintaining this fraudulent narrative that the US is fighting ISIS, whereas in reality, as these soldiers will find out when they arrive in the northeast, ISIS is considered to be another proxy of the US forces in Syria. At the same time, we've had visits by French delegations, which has been condemned by Syria. I think there have been two, one on the 3rd of July and one more recently on the 10th of July. There's also been a Catalan delegation arriving in the last 48 hours to negotiate or to speak with the Kurdish separatist factions in the northeast. Claiming that the reason that they went there was to repatriate 25 children and 10 adult women from northeast Syria who had been with ISIS. And not forgetting, of course, who has been a longtime supporter of the Kurdish separatist project and the autonomous region in the northeast is not only Victoria Nuland, from Washington, who of course was also responsible for the coup in Ukraine in 2014, but Bernard-Henri Lévy, of course, also heavily involved in many other NATO interventionist sites here with the Kurdish separatist fighters in what they have named Rojava, which is in fact northeast Syria. And at the same time as all of this is going on, and as the US is obviously building up its military presence, not only in Syria, but also in Anbar in Iraq and in Jordan, what happens the early hours of this morning, Brian, just moving on to the next slide. Israel bombed us at midnight this morning. Multiple missiles came in extremely fast. I was woken up very unceremoniously. And these landed about 3 kilometers away from my house, so the sound was actually very loud. They hit research and development base very close to here, and we believe, one of the air defense facilities also close to here. But this is a video which demonstrates that every time Israel attacks Syria, there are civilian casualties and losses. This is a young man returning home after the missile hit to find his home engulfed in flames.
قصف بيتي راح بيتي يا الله.
As if Syria hasn't suffered enough, the civilians have to deal with this on top of all the other hardships they're going through.
Vanessa, thank you very much for taking us through that. Of course, the hypocrisy over the cluster weapons, just phenomenal that somebody should be there in front of a camera talking about the cluster weapons. On the Russian side, this is terrible. But of course, if it's the US pumping them into Ukraine, it's absolutely fine. Hypocrisy, but also the deployment of troops. And I would suspect that as things ramp up in Ukraine, very fierce fighting on most of the fronts and a lot of extra pressure from the Russians. This is an attempt to increase the pressure on the Russians in Syria itself. Do you see it the same way, or do you think there's another reason for this sudden activity?
Well, the sudden activity has been going on for some time, but yes, I do think that there is potential now for another escalation on the Syrian front, either to try and distract Russia or on the basis that they think Russia is distracted in Ukraine. I mean, I can't get inside an American's head. It's very difficult. But certainly, you know, what they have demonstrated with the Captagon Act and all of these other acts and sanctions is that they are not going to release their hold on Syria without military escalation, basically.
Okay, Vanessa, thank you for that. Obviously, a key question is around the we. Who is the we? Who are they? I'm going to say a big thank you to one of our audience that sent in this, in fact, video clip we'll come on to in a moment. But the article here is a former Moldova MP, Laurie Roska. He's talking about multipolarity but really he's talking about only one center of real power. I've broken this down into 3 little clips. Let's have a look at the first video clip.
Allow me, I would like to start with my personal intellectual biography. I was obliged to make a paradigm shift several times in my life. I started as Soviet child. Yeah, I was born in USSR. My first paradigm shift was when I understood the essence, the dirty essence of communism. When I became mature, because I became student, I understood the conflict between USSR and the global communism and the liberal West, the free part of the world. Of course, I became anti-communist, anti-Soviet activist and journalist and politician and so on. And I was sure at that period, 35 years ago, that my country must be part of collective West. Not only myself, my generation had the same way of thinking, the same vision.
So there's a lot we can learn from these little clips, because here is this man saying very clearly, of course, he was born into a system which he initially believed and was not good, but then he looks over the garden fence and the grass is greener on the other side, and that grass is the collective West. Let's follow the clip through.
It exists. Worst part of the world, the worst, yeah, Soviet communism and Chinese communism and so on, and the Americans and Europeans, who are our dream, yeah, our dream, political dream, imagination was limited in this kind of interpretation. Bipolarity, it means good guys, bad guys, yeah. We didn't understand in that period the result of the Second World War. Who gained? No, not who won, who gained. Yeah. After that, I used to be street fighter, and I printed first generation of leaflets and clandestine newspapers and first meetings, street protests, first anti-communist party here in my country, Republic of Moldova. After that, I became a member of parliament 4 times. I was twice vice chairman of parliament, and I was during 25, I think, years leader of party, Christian Democratic People's Party.
So things begin to change, and we'll do the final clip as we see the whole frame of reference shifted. And what are we looking at? Things beyond the West and the collective West itself that are controlling the global agenda.
I think it happens in 2006 or 7, when I used to be a member of Joint Committee EU Republic of Moldova. We traveled permanently in Brussels, in other capitals, but especially in Brussels. And I discovered that our partners are trying to change family code and our constitution. It was the initial step in this total war against family, against normality, LGBT agenda. It was new for us. I was scandalized. I make a huge noise in Brussels. My partners were shocked, because Yuri used to be so clever, so good freedom fighter for Americans and Europeans.
Well, there we are. It changed, and suddenly the West was not what he believed it to be. It was not the bastion of freedom. And of course, what he then perceived was an attack on the family. Well, I've taken a couple of paraphrase quotes here from this particular gentleman, but he says very clearly the enemy is Western economic. He calls it imperialism and new colonialism, but he also talks about mental domination and domination in the media, which is perfectly correct. And if we move on here, this is where we get to really interesting comment. The greatest shock came in 2020 with the COVID operation, when we were able to see that we only have one global center of real power. And who is he now starting to focus on? Well, here it is. One center of power, obvious. Who? the World Health Organization was able to make orders to make major world powers move. So are we simply in the realms of powerful countries manipulating the people, the pieces on the world stage, or are we talking about agencies controlled by clearly very powerful people and money who are controlling the nation states themselves? Debbie, we've introduced